People love to romanticize the 1800s as an elegant era of fancy ball gowns and romantic carriage rides. But let us be brutally honest. If you traveled back then, you would literally be dead by Tuesday. Here are the 33 absolutely dumbest reasons you would not survive one single week in the 1800s. Forget glorious battlefield deaths. We are talking violently exploding toilets, parasitic diets, and doctors casually feeding you pure poison. 1. Imagine walking down a picturesque Victorian street in your finest outfit, only to be suddenly blasted into the sky by a giant geyser of raw sewage. When cities first started building underground sewer systems in the 1800s, engineers completely forgot about ventilation. Human waste naturally produces methane gas, which would aggressively build up in these dark tunnels until it reached critical mass. All it took was one random spark from a passing carriage or a discarded cigar, and boom. The immense pressure would violently blow heavy manhole covers hundreds of feet into the air, followed by a terrifying fountain of absolute filth, raining down on terrified pedestrians. You did not even need to be fighting a war to dodge explosions. You just had to walk to the bakery and pray the street did not detonate beneath your feet. 2. If you think modern diet fads are completely insane, you clearly have not heard about the Victorian secret to a snatched waistline. Women in the 1800s would willingly swallow capsules that were packed with live tapeworm eggs straight from diseased cows and pigs. The genius logic here was that the terrifying parasite would hatch inside your stomach and eat a huge portion of the food you consumed. You could eat endless amounts of cake while a giant, horrifying worm did all the heavy lifting for your figure. Once you reached your target weight, you then had to take violently toxic anti-parasite poisons to kill the beast, which often resulted in agonizing stomach cramps or just straight-up dying. Nothing screams high fashion quite like hosting a 10-foot alien parasite in your digestive tract just to fit into a tight corset. 3. Early steam locomotives were basically unguided missiles made of heavy iron that operated with zero safety regulations and completely useless brakes. Derailments were so incredibly common that instead of actually fixing the engineering issues, people turned railway disasters into an extreme spectator sport. Families would literally pack a lovely afternoon picnic with sandwiches and tea, travel to a known dangerous curve in the tracks, and just wait for a catastrophic accident to unfold. Promoters even started staging deliberate train crashes in front of massive cheering crowds, charging admission to watch tons of metal violently smash together. While passengers inside the actual trains were fighting for their lives in terrifying wreckage, the onlookers were happily munching on their snacks and clapping at the flying debris. It was essentially the 1800s version of watching reality television, just with way more shrapnel. 4. Long before anybody understood blood types, Victorian doctors decided to play a terrifying game of trial and error with human veins. They genuinely believed that fresh cow or goat milk was the absolute perfect substitute for human blood because it looked thick and nutritious. Medical professionals would eagerly pump raw, unpasteurized animal milk directly into the bloodstream of patients suffering from severe tuberculosis or cholera. They honestly expected these sick people to magically jump out of bed completely cured by dairy. Instead, the patients instantly went into severe immune shock. Their white blood cells went into absolute overdrive, and their kidneys immediately shut down. The practice had an astonishingly perfect failure rate, because every single person who received a milk transfusion died shortly after. Turns out you cannot just treat the human circulatory system like a morning bowl of cereal. 5. Decorating for the holidays used to be a highly festive way to permanently destroy your entire respiratory system. In the late 1800s, people desperately wanted their indoor Christmas trees to have that magical winter wonderland aesthetic. Since plastic fake snow did not exist yet, they bought boxes of pure, unadulterated white asbestos and joyfully sprinkled it all over their branches. This fluffy white mineral looked incredibly convincing and had the bonus feature of being highly fireproof against the dangerous tree candles. Families would sit around the glowing hearth, deeply inhaling millions of microscopic razor-sharp fibers that would permanently embed into their lung tissue. It was heavily marketed as completely safe and magical, but it was essentially a guaranteed ticket to getting severe lung cancer years later. Nothing says happy holidays quite like giving your entire household a fatal respiratory disease. 6. Conflict resolution in the 19th century was completely unhinged because any minor social awkwardness could immediately escalate into a literal deathmatch. If you accidentally bumped into a gentleman at the local pub or made a sarcastic joke about the ridiculous size of his coat, you were not just getting a stern look. You were getting formally challenged to a duel at dawn with loaded firearms. Men felt absolute intense pressure to defend their so-called honor over the most pathetic disagreements imaginable. You could literally lose your life just because someone thought you looked at their horse the wrong way. Instead of just apologizing or walking away, grown men would stand 20 paces apart and shoot heavy lead balls into each other's chests. Refusing the challenge made you a social outcast, so your only options were murder or total public humiliation. 7. Your innocent morning glass of milk was actually a terrifying chemical cocktail that belonged in a psychological horror movie. In rapidly growing cities, greedy dairy owners kept sick, dying cows tied up in filthy cellars next to breweries, feeding them nothing but toxic leftover alcohol mash. This disgusting diet produced thin, watery milk with a sickly blue tint that nobody in their right mind would ever want to drink. To fix this little marketing problem, they simply mixed in crushed chalk, plaster of Paris, and sometimes even mashed up raw calf brains to give it that thick, creamy white texture. They proudly sold this unholy concoction as pure country milk to unsuspecting families. It triggered massive waves of violent food poisoning, killing thousands of children before the government finally decided that serving plaster and animal brains as a beverage was a bad business model. 8. High fashion has never been more literally explosive than during the chaotic era of the crinoline hoop skirt. Women wore massive steel cages under their dresses to make them puff out to absurdly gigantic proportions, sometimes reaching up to 6 feet wide. These oversized fabric domes turned every single wearer into a massive walking fire hazard in a world lit entirely by open flames, candles, and coal grates. If a woman just brushed slightly too close to a fireplace, her massive skirt would instantly ignite like a dry piece of kindling. Because the heavy steel cage was tightly strapped to their waists with countless ribbons, they could not quickly take the dresses off to escape the roaring flames. Thousands of women tragically burned alive in their own living rooms simply because society decided that looking like a giant walking bell was the absolute peak of elegance. 9. Buying highly volatile military-grade explosives used to be as incredibly casual as picking up a loaf of bread at the corner store. Any random person could just stroll into their local hardware shop and purchase huge wooden crates of raw dynamite with absolutely zero background checks or safety licenses. It was aggressively marketed for everyday farming needs, like clearing stubborn tree stumps or moving large rocks out of a potato field. Naturally, regular people with zero demolitions training stored these sweating sticks of nitroglycerin right in their warm barns or heavily heated kitchens. This inevitably led to random, catastrophic explosions that would completely vaporize entire families, livestock, and farmhouses in the blink of an eye. You really had to carefully choose your neighbors, because one clumsy farmer down the road could accidentally blow up your entire neighborhood on a Tuesday afternoon. 10. Medical first aid in the 1800s was basically a masterclass in how to turn a tiny scratch into a spectacular fatal infection. If you cut your leg on a rusty nail or suffered a bad burn, local healers genuinely believed the absolute best course of action was to slap a massive handful of fresh cow or horse manure directly onto your open wound. They confidently claimed this warm, steaming pile of filth would magically draw the bad toxins out of your damaged body. In reality, they were aggressively packing a highly vulnerable injury with billions of lethal bacteria. Instead of healing, the patient would almost immediately develop severe lockjaw from tetanus, or watch their limb turn black from fast-spreading gangrene. Trying to cure a simple paper cut with farm animal waste is a fantastic way to ensure you never have to worry about paying taxes again. 11. The penny farthing bicycle is that iconic Victorian machine with a comically massive front wheel and a ridiculously tiny back wheel. It looks charming in vintage photographs, but riding one was essentially a high-speed suicide mission. Because your seat was perched dangerously high directly over the front axle, the center of gravity was an absolute disaster waiting to happen. These wooden death traps had absolutely zero brakes and solid rubber tires that absorbed zero shock. Hitting even the tiniest pebble, a small rut in the dirt, or a random stray dog would instantly lock the giant wheel. Physics would aggressively take over, catapulting the sharply dressed rider forward like a human cannonball, sending them flying headfirst straight into the unforgiving cobblestone streets. It was the absolute fastest way to shatter your skull while looking incredibly dapper in a tweed suit. 12. The Victorians were so completely obsessed with a specific vibrant shade of emerald green that they happily poisoned their entire families just to get it. This beautiful pigment was completely formulated using pure, highly toxic arsenic, and they aggressively painted literally everything with it. They plastered their living room walls with arsenic wallpaper, dyed their expensive ball gowns with it, and even colored their young children's toys green. When the wallpaper got slightly damp from the terrible British weather, it released invisible, deadly arsenic gas directly into the unventilated rooms. Wealthy homeowners were mysteriously suffering from massive hair loss, severe skin lesions, and agonizing organ failure, completely oblivious that their gorgeous interior decorating was aggressively murdering them in their sleep. You basically paid a massive fortune to turn your own luxurious mansion into a highly effective, beautifully decorated gas chamber. 13. The summer of 1858 in London was so incredibly disgusting that it literally broke the entire British government. The River Thames had essentially been used as an open-air toilet for millions of residents, serving as a massive dumping ground for raw sewage, slaughterhouse waste, and toxic industrial chemicals. When a brutal heat wave hit the city, the baked river cooked up a stench so aggressively horrific that it earned the historical title of the Great Stink. The smell of fermented human waste was so incredibly overpowering that members of parliament tried soaking their window curtains in chloride of lime just to survive the workday. The stench was so physically revolting and induced so much mass vomiting that the government was eventually forced to completely shut down and abandon the building. It turns out the most effective political protest is just weaponized diarrhea. 14. If you visited a Victorian pharmacy complaining of a bad migraine or a simple stomachache, the pharmacist might literally prescribe you a glass jar of ground-up dead people. European society was completely obsessed with anything related to ancient Egypt, and they somehow got the absolutely psychotic idea that consuming ancient royalty was excellent for your general health. Grave robbers would steal thousand-year-old mummies, crush their perfectly preserved bodies into a fine dust, and sell it as a premium medical powder. Wealthy aristocrats were joyfully stirring the pulverized bones and dried flesh of ancient pharaohs into their hot tea to cure a basic cough. It is absolutely wild that 19th-century gentlemen considered themselves the absolute peak of modern civilized society, while casually practicing luxury cannibalism at the breakfast table just to cure a minor hangover. 15. Hot air ballooning was the ultimate thrill ride of the era, but it usually ended up looking more like a terrifying flaming meteor strike. Promoters wanted to make quick money, so they built massive balloons out of incredibly cheap, highly flammable canvas or heavily oiled paper. They would heat these giant flying death traps using an open fire suspended right beneath the easily combustible fabric. Predictably, a slight gust of wind would tilt the flames, instantly turning the glorious airborne vessel into a magnificent fireball thousands of feet in the sky. Massive crowds gathered in public parks, supposedly to admire the miracle of human flight, but they regularly ended up witnessing traumatizing aerial tragedies instead. It was completely unregulated, wildly dangerous, and basically a total guarantee that the brave aeronaut would plummet to Earth like a giant, screaming matchstick. 16. The bread you bought from your local 19th-century baker was basically a baked chemical weapon hiding in plain sight. Consumers strongly preferred bright white bread because it was heavily viewed as a major symbol of high social status and extreme wealth. To meet this ridiculous demand on a budget, shady bakers took the absolute worst, darkest, most deeply moldy flour they could find and aggressively bleached it. They heavily mixed in a toxic chemical compound called alum, which is typically used for dyeing fabrics and treating wastewater. This gave the bread a beautiful snowy color, but completely destroyed its nutritional value and violently tore apart the human digestive system. Families eating their daily toast suffered from horrific chronic diarrhea, severe bowel inflammation, and extreme malnutrition. Your innocent morning sandwich was quite literally slowly eroding your internal organs away. 17. Before Louis Pasteur finally invented a miraculous vaccine in 1885, encountering a stray dog was a terrifying game of Russian roulette. Cities were absolutely swarming with thousands of wild, unvaccinated street dogs roaming every single neighborhood. If you got bitten by an infected animal, it was an absolute guaranteed death sentence with a 100% mortality rate. You would completely lose your mind, develop a horrifying fear of drinking water, and suffer a slow, agonizing demise that looked exactly like demonic possession. People were so incredibly terrified of rabies that a simple scratch from a cute neighborhood puppy could instantly trigger absolute mass hysteria. If the symptoms started showing, doctors could literally do nothing but lock you in a dark room. Getting chased by a dog today is annoying, but back then it meant making very rapid funeral arrangements. 18. If you walked into a doctor's office with a terrible cough or severe asthma, the highly educated medical professional would literally prescribe you a heavy smoking habit. Instead of giving you an inhaler, they confidently handed you special medical cigarettes designed to magically clear up your lungs. These were not just regular tobacco products. They were aggressively packed with highly toxic plants like deadly nightshade and stramonium. You were essentially inhaling the poisonous smoke of a hallucinogenic weed to cure a basic respiratory disease. Patients would puff away on these lethal botanicals, temporarily numbing their screaming throats while actively destroying their lung capacity and occasionally experiencing absolute terrifying hallucinations. It was the absolute only era in human history where your trusted doctor actively encouraged you to smoke pure poison for your daily health. 19. Traveling by river in the 1800s was a magnificent way to accidentally get blown to absolute smithereens before you even reached your destination. Steamboat captains were fiercely competitive and completely obsessed with breaking speed records to attract wealthy paying customers. To get extra power, they would deliberately tie down the crucial safety release valves on their massive high-pressure steam boilers. They were aggressively pushing cheap iron tanks way past their physical limits just to shave a few hours off a routine trip. Naturally, these incredibly stressed boilers would violently detonate without any warning, instantly ripping the giant wooden ships in half and sending passengers flying into the muddy river. Booking a luxury river cruise essentially meant completely trusting your life to a reckless captain who aggressively treated a giant floating bomb like a sports car. 20. Dental hygiene. Before modern medicine was basically a horrific demolition project happening right inside your own mouth. Because proper toothpaste was not widely available, people desperately resorted to scrubbing their teeth with a highly abrasive homemade paste made of actual chimney soot and rough salt. You would literally scrape the filthy black dust from your fireplace and aggressively rub it all over your sensitive gums. While this horrible gritty mixture did technically remove some surface stains, it acted exactly like heavy industrial sandpaper. It brutally stripped away the protective tooth enamel in a record time, exposing the ultra-sensitive nerves and guaranteeing massive painful cavities. Having a bright white smile essentially required you to deliberately sandblast your own teeth every morning until they completely rotted away and violently fell right out of your completely ruined skull. 21. Building the first towering skyscrapers and massive steel suspension bridges was an absolute free for all of zero workplace safety regulations. Construction workers were casually walking on extremely narrow steel beams hundreds of feet in the air wearing absolutely nothing but slick leather shoes and extreme confidence. There were no safety harnesses tied to their waists, no protective hard hats, and completely zero safety nets to catch anyone who lost their precarious balance. A sudden strong gust of wind or a tiny slip of the foot meant you were immediately plummeting straight down to the unforgiving concrete pavement below. Falling off a massive bridge construction site was just casually calculated as a standard acceptable cost of doing business. It makes modern extreme sports look like an absolute joke when normal people risked their lives daily just to earn a completely basic weekly paycheck. 22. Whenever Victorian athletes or completely exhausted factory workers desperately needed a quick boost of energy, they did not reach for a warm cup of coffee. They went straight for pure, unadulterated rat poison. Strychnine was incredibly popular as a highly dangerous performance-enhancing stimulant. In very tiny, heavily measured doses, this violently toxic chemical aggressively triggered the human nervous system, making muscles twitch and giving the tired user a sudden jolt of frantic energy. Professional marathon runners would casually sip rat poison mixed with strong brandy mid-race just to keep their heavy legs moving. Of course, getting the dosage even slightly wrong immediately resulted in agonizing muscle convulsions, total body paralysis, and an absolutely excruciating death. Red Bull might claim to give you wings, but Victorian stimulants gave you a direct one-way ticket to the afterlife. 23. Top-tier medical science was completely convinced that all deadly diseases were caused by absolutely nothing but bad smells. According to the highly respected miasma theory, you caught terrible illnesses like cholera or the bubonic plague simply by breathing in foul-smelling vapor. Because of this absolute nonsense, everyday people completely ignored the actual massive danger of drinking raw sewage water because it did not always smell particularly terrible. Meanwhile, they were utterly terrified of perfectly fresh night air. Families would aggressively seal their bedroom windows completely shut in the middle of boiling hot summers, violently suffocating in their own cramped rooms just to keep the invisible bad smells away. They were proudly drinking literal toilet water at the dinner table while violently hiding in fear from a gentle, perfectly harmless evening breeze outside their extremely stuffy homes. 24. Before the magnificent invention of inflatable rubber tires, going for a casual afternoon bike ride was a highly traumatic medical event. Early bicycles were very accurately nicknamed bone shakers because they were entirely constructed from extremely heavy solid wood frames and extremely stiff wrought iron wheels. Riding this massive heavy contraption over the terribly uneven, deeply rutted cobblestone streets of the 1800s was absolute medieval torture. Every single violent bump in the road aggressively shot straight up your spine with absolutely zero shock absorption. Riders regularly suffered from severely dislocated vertebrae, completely shattered teeth, and massive internal bruising just from taking a quick trip around the neighborhood park. It was significantly less of a fun recreational vehicle, and way more of a highly mobile medieval torture device designed to completely ruin your back. 25. Basic urban hydration was an absolutely terrifying daily gamble of extreme biological warfare against your own stomach. Cities were completely expanding way faster than their basic underground infrastructure, meaning the exact same rivers and public wells used for fresh drinking water were also the main dumping grounds for human waste. You would innocently send a child to fetch a nice heavy bucket of water for dinner, entirely unaware that a severely infected cholera patient had just used the river completely upstream as their own personal bathroom. Completely invisible deadly bacteria multiplied aggressively in the warm, deeply stagnant city wells. Drinking a single refreshing glass of cool water could instantly trigger a violently fatal case of cholera, violently draining absolutely all the vital fluids from your completely helpless body in a matter of a few agonizing and incredibly painful hours. 26. If you unfortunately suffered from chronic migraines or minor epilepsy, your highly respected local doctor had an absolutely horrific surgical solution waiting just for you. They genuinely believed that massive bad pressure or evil, invisible spirits were physically trapped inside your skull and simply needed a very convenient exit door. Without any modern medical anesthesia whatsoever, the terrifying surgeon would grab a crude metal hand drill and literally bore a giant gaping hole directly through your bone and right into your brain cavity. This terrifying medical procedure is called tree panning, and it was performed with completely unwashed, heavily blood-stained instruments in highly unsanitary conditions. Unsurprisingly, drilling an open drafty window right into a screaming patient's fragile brain usually resulted in massive fatal infections rather than actually curing their highly annoying headache. 27. Stepping right outside your beautiful front door meant immediately entering an absolute biological hazard zone of epic proportions. Before reliable cars were finally invented, Millions of hardworking horses were the absolute backbone of all city transportation, and they left completely unbelievable mountains of horrible waste behind. Major busy streets in massive places like New York and London were constantly buried under a massive, incredibly foul-smelling layer of raw horse manure that could literally reach up to a meter deep in certain areas. When it heavily rained, the dirt roads instantly turned into a highly toxic, violently splashing liquid soup of absolute filth that completely ruined your expensive leather boots. In the blazing summer heat, the rapidly dried manure turned into a suffocating dust storm that aggressively bred millions of disease-carrying flies that invaded every single home. 28. Insane celebrity diet culture is absolutely not a modern invention, but the extreme Victorian version was exceptionally unhinged and highly dangerous. The incredibly famous poet Lord Byron desperately wanted to constantly maintain a pale, painfully thin, romantic aesthetic, so he popularized an absolutely brutal weight loss regimen. His highly dedicated wealthy followers would eagerly drink large quantities of pure, highly acidic vinegar every single day. This aggressive chemical completely destroyed their stomach lining, causing violent daily vomiting and a total, absolute loss of any natural appetite. They successfully stayed incredibly skinny because their heavily damaged digestive systems were completely ruined, making them physically unable to digest actual real food. It was essentially the 1800s method of dissolving your internal organs just to look fashionably frail at expensive dinner parties. 29. Upgrading your fancy home to modern indoor gas lighting was the absolute ultimate wealthy status symbol, but it also silently turned your beautiful bedroom into a highly lethal trap. These early, highly experimental indoor gas pipes were incredibly poorly sealed and constantly leaked raw, highly toxic unburned coal gas directly into the enclosed living spaces. The deadly gas had absolutely no added warning odor like the safety chemicals we have today. Completely exhausted families would blow out their lamps, climb straight into bed, and peacefully fall asleep while their entire expensive house rapidly filled with violently toxic fumes. They would quietly suffocate in the complete dark, entirely unaware that their extremely expensive luxury lighting system had just silently assassinated the entire household without making a single sound. Technology back then was literally out to destroy absolutely everyone. 30. You absolutely did not need to work a grueling 12-hour shift in a highly dangerous coal mine to completely destroy your fragile respiratory system. The intense industrial revolution meant absolutely everything was heavily powered by burning massive amounts of incredibly cheap, terribly dirty coal. The skies over major booming cities were constantly choked with an incredibly thick, heavy, highly toxic yellow smog that literally blocked out the actual bright sun. Simply walking down the street to your boring office job or hanging wet laundry outside perfectly forced you to aggressively inhale toxic black ash with every single breath you took. Medical autopsies of perfectly normal bank clerks and rich housewives routinely revealed completely blackened, totally ruined lungs that looked exactly like those of veteran coal miners. The city air itself was basically smoking 20 packs of cigarettes every single day. 31. Working a normal shift in a matchstick factory was basically a totally guaranteed sentence to an absolutely horrific physical mutation. The completely underpaid workers, mostly young women, spent up to 14 hours a day aggressively inhaling highly toxic white phosphorus vapors that were completely necessary to coat the tiny match heads. This extreme chemical exposure specifically targeted the highly vulnerable bones in their face, causing a terrifying medical condition called phossy jaw. Their actual jaw bones would slowly start to rot completely away, creating massive, unbelievably painful facial abscesses. The absolute craziest part of this horrific nightmare is that the severely dying bone tissue would literally glow a sickly bright green in the complete dark. Factory owners completely ignored this horrific rotting disease until the terrified workers finally organized massive, highly aggressive city strikes. 32. When massive booming cities finally decided to install actual running water directly into wealthy family homes, they made a phenomenally stupid and highly lethal material choice. Almost all of the completely new, highly expensive underground plumbing networks were constructed entirely out of pure, highly toxic, soft lead pipes. As the slightly acidic city water slowly flowed through these magnificent pipes, it constantly absorbed massive heavy doses of absolute invisible poison. Entire incredibly upscale neighborhoods were completely unknowingly drinking highly toxic lead with every single cup of morning tea and warm bowl of evening soup. This completely absurd engineering disaster caused massive permanent neurological damage, extreme chronic fatigue, and severe organ failure across massive city populations. They completely revolutionized modern convenience while accidentally poisoning themselves on a massively unprecedented scale. 33. Perhaps the most incredibly enraging reason you would completely fail to survive the 1800s was the sheer terrifying arrogance of highly educated medical professionals. Top surgeons would literally spend their entire morning actively dissecting deeply rotting, highly diseased corpses down in the hospital morgue, and then immediately walk upstairs to manually deliver a newborn baby. They completely refused to wash their filthy hands or change their heavily blood-soaked medical aprons. When a few incredibly smart scientists actually suggested that simple soap and hand washing could save thousands of lives, the entire medical community was deeply offended. They arrogantly declared that a true respected gentleman simply cannot have dirty hands. Their massive, fragile egos were actively slaughtering endless waves of completely innocent patients with highly preventable and incredibly aggressive hospital infections. The 1800s were basically a massive daily suicide mission, disguised in incredibly fancy corsets. Now, I know there are massive history nerds watching this who are screaming at their screens right now. So, what absolutely ridiculous, brain-dead Victorian hazard did I completely fail to mention? Expose my ignorance down in the comments and drop the dumbest facts I missed. Also, smash that like button and subscribe, unless you actually enjoy brushing your teeth with chimney soot.